to start this meeting off. Very quickly and very briefly so we can get to our speaker. This is the June meeting, IEEE Central Texas section, two groups, the Life Member Affinity Group and the Consultants Network Affinity Group, along with multiple Life Member Affinity groups from other places in the region 5. And you all know what this Consultants Network does. We just bring people together and try to help each other find jobs. The Life Member Group enjoys mostly retirement. For the most part, you have to be 65 to become a Life Member. We also host monthly meetings. Our topic area is a little broader. We'll talk about anything that interests old people. We do ask you to send suggestions for future meeting topics, and especially the Life Member Group, it doesn't have to be a meeting like this. It can be a field trip. Where would you like to go? Something interesting around here you'd like to see? Maybe something ERCOT is doing. We could figure out if we could arrange a tour in there. Officers, we'll just go over briefly. We have a bunch of officers. We'll talk about this a lot more in the coming months because we're about to enter the election cycle for IEEE, and many of the names you see here have reached term limit, and we will have to shuffle. We will have to find new people. And next month's meeting, we're kind of excited about space technology for planetary exploration, and Kendra Cook is a senior systems engineer at NASA's JPL. She will be giving us this talk. She gave a talk very similar to this to the big National Life Member Conference, very well received. We think you'll want to tune in to that. And it brings us to tonight's meeting, Economic Outlook. We have Dr. Stuart Greenfield with us, retired Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts. And you can see his bio here. He joined the Comptroller's office in 1977, State of Texas Comptroller office, worked for 3 controllers in public accounts and other state agencies. Since retiring, he's taught economics at ACC and the University of Maryland, presumably online. Born in Brooklyn, New York, grew up in New Jersey, graduated from University of Dayton with a BS degree in economics, then came to UT Austin, as many folks here did. We came to Austin, got his PhD in economics in 1975. So with that, we'll turn it over to Dr. Greenfield.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, again, my brother is an electrical engineer, and I always wanted to talk to a group of Sparkies so I can impress my brother and tell him I talk to your people with comparable skills to you. In the introduction, I did do economic forecasts at the Comptroller's office, which became an input to the revenue estimate, which the Comptroller does each biennium, which certifies how much money the legislature has to spend. Since then, I've done some other stuff, but I've still kept an interest in economics. So one of the things that I'm going to try to do is to provide you with at least some background of why we're in the economic conditions that we're in. And as you can see here, where the economy is today, this green line shows what the economy could produce given its endowment of resources and the state of technology. If we have more resources, land, labor, capital, we could produce more. If we have fewer resources, we produce less, or potentially we can produce less. New technologies, and there is the great discussion going on with AI and GAI and LLMs and whatever. And I'm very positive about it. I think that artificial, or what some people and I prefer calling augmented intelligence, will have a significant impact on one's knowledge, or at least one's acquisition of knowledge, and obtaining it more quickly in a much more usable form, as opposed to doing a Google search. So you can see here the dashed line shows where the actual economy is relative to what it could be producing. And as you can see, at least for the last 2.5 years, we've been operating at our potential. It'd be difficult, given our endowment of resources, to produce more. I'm not sure what the color is here, but it may have been red, shows what the full employment or the full unemployment rate would be, which is about 4%. The purple line shows this is the COVID uptick. And as you can see, it did a number on the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate was actually under the full employment rate. And then with COVID, it shot up. We are now back to full employment. So the economy is operating at its potential. We could do a little bit better, but not much. And to give you, again, some perspectives of where the U.S. economy is compared to China, Japan, this is the U.S., the Eurozone, and the world. So relative to other developed countries, Japan and the Eurozone, we've done quite well. We haven't done as well as China, but even the Chinese economic growth rate is now down to 5 or 6%. Okay, so relatively speaking, we've done well relative to our counterparts in the developed world. Okay, and when I teach, I talk about my century. I'm a baby boomer, as I assume many of you are. We were born in 46 to 64. And as you can see, economic growth, even though it fluctuated, the blue line, its average is above. What we're facing here is, and all of you are aware of, first and second derivatives, is the second derivative problem. The rate of growth is positive. The first derivative is positive, but the second derivative is negative. So we're increasing, but at a decreasing rate. And we will expect that to continue. Okay? And the reasons for this decline is exemplified here. These charts are major measures of the labor force. Labor accounts for 60% of resources being used, if you look at the compensation of workers. So you can see here, the red line shows the employment to population ratio. And as you can see, beginning in the 40s, what happened? The ratio of people in the labor force who were working, were employed, that proportion increased. It peaked in 2000, and now the ratio, the percentage of people of the population that is employed has been declining. The other measure, this squiggly line, is the working age population, and it's the growth rate. And as you can see here, what has happened to the growth rate? It's declining. And it's a second derivative problem. Our workforce is growing, but it's growing at a decreasing rate. And then the third measure is, well, if we have a smaller percentage of the population working and the labor force is growing at a slower rate, what can we do to get more work activity? Well, we could have people work more hours, but as you can see here, the bottom graph is what? Is pretty much of a flat line. People are working 41 hours a week, and that hasn't changed much over time. And the second reason, and this is a continuation of the first reason, is that if you look at the two driving forces behind economic growth is the growth in the labor force and then worker productivity. How do we make the existing workforce more productive? We can do it through
It's me.
education, or whatever. If you look here, this first chart shows the compound annual growth rate in productivity in the labor force for the entire period from 1948 to 2023. And if you summed up these numbers, 2.1 and 1, remember those two numbers. Yeah. And then between 48 and 99, the increase was 2.2 and 1.6. And now if you get into what I call, when I teach, all of my students were born in this century. So I categorize these periods as my century and their century. And you can see what has happened. Productivity has declined by about 20%. The growth rate in productivity has declined, but the labor force has really taken a hit, going from 1.6% per year to 0.7. So it's literally been cut by more than half. So again, that's contributing to the slowdown in the rate of economic growth. Now, where the economy is today is looked at as, this is what's called the JOLTS chart. It's the job opening report that the Bureau of Labor Statistics issues. And then the red line shows the number of people unemployed, and the blue line shows the number of job openings. And for much of the century, we had more unemployed people than we had job openings. So we could fill all the job openings with what? Unemployed people. You can see what happened beginning in 2018. Job openings exceeded unemployed. And then eliminating COVID, once the COVID shock was remedied, what do we see now? We have more job openings than we do unemployed people. So people say, well, just get all these people to work. That's bullshit. Okay? We need more people than we have unemployed. And there will always be some number of people unemployed. So there's about 1.6 million more people, 1.6 million more job openings than there are people unemployed. in 22, it was almost twice. There was like 5.5 million people unemployed, and there were like 11 million job openings. I mean, workers were just whatever. So last week, the Federal Open Market Committee, the Federal Reserve Bank's policymaking group met, and at each meeting, they issue an economic projection. One of the things you'll observe, the dashed blue line shows what's called the federal funds rate. That's the rate the Fed controls, and which is the rate banks lend money to each other, but the Fed has control over it through its buying and selling of government bonds. And as you can see, today it's about 5.5%. And everybody's waiting for it to drop because the Fed feels that if the inflation rate, which did not improve that much with the release today of the GDP report, but over time, over the next 2 years, they expect it to drop to about 3%. But that will still be a lot higher than it was during much of the period, actually from the period after the great financial recession of 2008 and 2009. The federal funds rate was near zero for a long period of time. And with that, we had the longest business expansion of all time. The decade of 2010 to 2019 was the longest period of economic growth in the history of the country, and we had no recession. The recession ended in June of 2009, and then we didn't have a second one until yeah, we had a recession in 2020. This grayed area shows a recession, but from 2010 through 2019, we had the golden year of economic growth. So what we observe in terms of the Fed's forecast is not much change in the unemployment rate. It will stay at around 4%. We will be at a full employment level, yeah, what's called the non-cyclical employment rate. And yeah, and then GDP growth again is a flat line. It's going to grow at about 2.5%. And there ain't much you can do about it. The policies tonight, the two principal candidates for the presidency will be debating. It will be interesting to hear what they have to say. The one policy that both share, which as an economist, and which as most economists would agree, is the stupidest thing to do, is to impose tariffs on goods. Because if you impose a tariff, imposing a tariff is like imposing a sales tax, which does what to the price you pay? It goes up. So if you wanted to reduce prices, what you should do is subsidize Chinese imports to make them even cheaper, okay? But that's my sense of humor, so please overlook that. But if you really wanted to reduce prices, imposing tariffs is not the ideal way to go. One of the other things, and both candidates seem to disagree with, is the role of immigration. I live at a very nice, with a very nice retirement community. And the one thing we need is more workers, okay? Either to maintenance workers or uh, dining staff, cooks, servers, and so on. And I've always thought, and you'll have to forgive my Jersey sense of humor, but I was going to suggest to the executive director that he get together with the other directors of these various retirement communities because they all need workers and write a letter to the governor and the lieutenant governor saying instead of sending busloads of workers to Philadelphia and New York and Chicago, send a busload to Westminster. We can use them, okay? That's not a very desirable, I find it the more rational policy to pursue, but it's not one that will sell very well among the political class. There are various, is this connected to the internet?
This an improvement. The default assumption of communication is that the author's or speaker's intentions are open, avowable, and make recognition as easy as is
Okay,
reasonable.
that's fine. These are links to various outlooks, and I'll send this document a link that Kay can share with you, and so you can look
The
at it.
default
Again,
assumption
most of the
sometimes is
forecasts are
overridden,
in the same
and when it
ballpark
is
as the Fed.
overridden the
There is
right
no
way,
great
is that better than, of course, the default assumption
factor
sometimes is superseded.
that's going to occur, that's going to spur economic growth. You know, AI will add a few tenths of a percent possibly, but there's still controversy with that. I'm a big proponent of it, but for every person like me, there's people who are saying, oh, be careful, which I agree, we need to be. But I think it's going to be will help people acquire knowledge more quickly and in a much more usable form. And I think it's going to be the duty or the obligation of the schools and the universities to explain to students how to use it in the correct way. It is not to be used to cheat, but it's to be used to supplement, to augment your intelligence. And so that's why I think calling it augmented intelligence to me seems a, a better way of calling AI than that. Yeah, so most of the economic forecasts are in line, low unemployment, a 4% rate, which historically is, yeah, a quite low rate of unemployment. And economic growth is going to be in the 2% range. And the reason for that is by the end of this decade, all of us boomers will have turned 65. And I would assume that most boomers prefer taking cruises than teaching 17-year-olds. So I enjoy teaching. So I will hope to continue to teach at least for another couple of years. But I think, again, we will see what the candidates have to offer. One of the things that promoted economic growth and why last year economic growth was significantly greater than it is this year was the impact of the infrastructure bill. Okay, one, it was $1 trillion of government spending was spent on infrastructure, building new roads, improving airports, improving ports, etc. Okay, and we're not seeing that impact has been diminished. Also, we've seen the significant increase from near zero federal funds rate to 5.5%. And you can see what's happened with housing has declined somewhat, even though it's now picking up. So we'll see what happens.
There's a question from Jack. Besides the unskilled, low-skilled jobs, we need workers. How about the professional or engineering?
Oh no, we need STEM grads and so on. It's not to say we need workers across the board. Okay. However, it has become more and more difficult to hire service workers, people who deal with, years ago, I remember listening to two economists being interviewed on PBS, and one of them, and I think his name is David Autor, Autour, who's done a lot of work on labor markets and analyzed what caused the downturn in the 90s, which was globalization and technology. But one of the things he said is if you want a job, learn one that deals with face-to-face communications, because you can't import that. It's difficult to import plumbers or heating and ventilation people or people at the restaurant. Okay. And with the greater digitalization that's going on, but we still need STEM people to develop these new products and tools that will make our lives easier.
I wonder if maybe they would chip out. So we invest money to do craft, but we don't have enough money to train enough engineer technicians.
That is very true. To me, okay. Many economists, if not most economists, would advocate coming up with a better immigration policy. In general, people who migrate are younger, better educated people. And that occurred, if you look at the mass migrations that occurred even internally in the US, who are the people who moved from the South to the North? There were generally people younger and better educated. Old people like me aren't likely to be immigrating. So if we had a better way of processing and allowing immigrants in would be a thing. But it's quite obvious politically you can't do it. I mean, which is irritating to me. Probably all of us, my grandparents came from Poland and the Ukraine. And it was interesting to watch their transition from landing in Ellis Island. They first started out where many immigrants do in the textile business, working at a sewing machine in New York, stitching clothes. But over time, they improved themselves. And ultimately, my one grandfather owned a bar and grill in Brooklyn, and the other one, who I never met, owned a candy store. And I thought, oh, I wish I had met him. Okay. So, and if you look at the history of immigration, it's always been that case that the families and the individuals, they move because either they there's a pull factor. People want to do better. Okay. Or a push factor, fear of being attacked or being killed, or the lack, and now with global warming, there's some real issues, in Latin and South America. So to me, immigration, coming up with a more rational, less political plan would be a big benefit. And even Bill Gates has been an advocate, and now former President Trump, of giving green cards to overseas students who graduate from college. I think Gates wanted to give it only to STEM grads. He wanted to discriminate. But that to me is the lowest hanging. I'm not real sure, we've made an effort with infrastructure, but look at the time it requires us to build infrastructure. And by the time we get it built, the highways, the I-35 expansion is going to be overrun anyway. So, yeah, that to me, and I assume making an effort to ensure everyone is getting a quality education. I mean, I'm impressed that ACC is now offering free tuition to graduates who live in the ACC taxing district. That if you graduate, you can take advantage of the plethora of courses being offered. And I know they have an engineering program with A&M that you can get 2 years of credit and then transfer to A&M. And I'm not sure about, but they're trying to make an effort to provide literally like the German education with apprenticeships for quote, call it blue collar work, working on the Tesla assembly plant, or more labor intensive. Some of the techie things, everyone's talking now about the AI farms that are sitting there. They employ a lot of people to build the infrastructure, but there's not much employment after that in terms of, nursing the servers. It's not like, I remember when I was in high school, we took a field trip to the Ford assembly plant in Tarrytown, New York. And at the end of the assembly line were two guys standing in a pit with an air gun, and they tightened the lugs on the tires. I was not a sterling high school student, and I thought, oh, that would be an easy job. Well, what has happened to that job? A robot now is, and if you look at the auto assembly plants in the 1930s compared to what they are, I recently went on to visit the Toyota factory. I mean, not to say you could eat off the floors, but you know, they had a gym there and then just a very posh place. And it wasn't shoulder to shoulder anymore. So yeah, I'm just not sure, to me, other than immigration, that there's much, you know, low hanging fruit. Um,
Another question online, and we have that by the same guy. What is the lag in inflation, cause, and effect? In other words, the causes for the inflation that things started, I guess, during COVID.
yeah, and what people, I don't think, and I blame President Biden for when he first took office, he handed out one eight, what, how much, $1,200 per person. Under former President Trump, it, there was less given to kids. But all of a sudden, people, if you have a family of four, you got a check for $5,000. Well, what do people do with more income? Well, your kids want a better iPhone. Okay. You want a better, instead of having a plasma TV, you now want an OLED TV. So with more money, you go out and buy stuff. Well, an increase in demand raises prices. The other thing that occurred, so I sort of said, why are you doing this? Don't you understand? I mean, you're a better trained economist than me in the Council of Economic Advisors, President Biden. So, and then you had the supply chain issues, you know, cutting off getting items from overseas. You know, when we import, I wish I could recall, we import a lot of stuff into this country. Um, you know, it's about 4 trillion of goods most of it is goods. And I'm just not sure how long this process would be. In the early 80s, when inflation skyrocketed to double digits, it took them a couple of years. And it doesn't appear that it will probably take a few more years. Now, what the Fed may do is they're saying, in the environment we're living in, the 1.5 to 2.5% rate of inflation was our policy objective, is no longer feasible. That we're going to have to be willing to accept maybe a 2.5 to 3% rate of inflation. And one of the things to remember, even though if the inflation rate went to 0 tomorrow, okay, the inflation rate is showing the rate of change in prices. So even if it went to 0, a box of cereal is still going to be $5.99. Okay, and I don't see anything about us experiencing deflation. Yeah, so I think it's going to take quite a bit of time, and you know, like the Fed. What happened to it? I always. What? Oh. Where are yeah. So, Yeah, I didn't have their forecast of inflation, but it'll stay probably in the 2.5 to 3.5 range.
Seems to me that these FOMC projections, they don't say anything about deficit spending. And that obviously, what are they assuming? And do they assume it's? still-
Okay, I would have been more than happy if I could have opened the document, the CBO, the count.
We need to keep spending at gigantic rates to even get. the
Well,
relative
okay.
honest-
Okay, I'm over 65. Are you over 60? Okay. 65, right? Okay. 70% of the federal budget goes to you and I in terms of Social Security and Medicare. Both,
That's not the federal government giving from their reserves, right? You saved all your life. They're just giving.
no, that's not the way the system works. No, it's not a pot. How the Social Security and Medicare system work, it's a cash in, cash out system. So when all of us were working, we were putting in a lot of money. And we thought, oh, it's going to be in our account. Well, yeah, we have an account, but that account means garbage. I mean, the law says here's what they are obligated to provide us with each month. And yes. Wait. Okay. Yeah. Well, but okay. But what happens, and I would show my students this graph. Beginning, I think in the late 50s, there were about 4 million boomers born. So all through the 60s, there were over 4 million boomers born. So add 65 to 1960 and you get 2025. And there'll be 4 million more boomers become eligible for Social Security.
Assume that there's no adjustment, you keep spending, there's no reduction in benefits, there's no.
None. When
Even with the threat, you're saying, even with the threatening gigantic expansion of deficit spending, we get only like a modest, slowly decreasing rate of economic, and then of course that assumes stability, which is not the normal case in the universe of any kind of mathematical system, you know? So this seems like everyone stay calm, it looks fine, but the biggest variable is not even shown.
no, and like I said, I asked my students to look at the budget analysis, the federal budget, and oh no, it's not that we're bankrupt, because it turns out that this is really going to confuse you. But when we buy stuff from overseas, we send dollars overseas. Okay, but what happens is those dollars come back. Like both China and Japan hold $1 trillion of the US debt. They've been big purchasers of it, and people
Panama
want
scored.
security.
Now there's been some fighting.
So,
The Panamanian guy was sent off because he purposely tripped Pulisic, and then
The,
some fighting
no,
happened
you're
back out
right. I
there
mean,
with the big
but the
hair.
Congressional
sent
Budget
off.
Office, all it can do is operate under current law. But,
Yeah,
and it's pretty obvious the politicians aren't going to do, they're scared to death.
yeah.
Yes.
Oh, wait, I thought that guy was off. That guy, but he doesn't
Okay.
look like.
Any analysis.
Maybe he is walking off.
And,
I don't know where it is.
okay.
They predict
And,
exactly-
and if you think about it, both candidates are going to do
Yeah,
what?
they're succeeding.
Promise things to people. You know, former President Trump wants to, there's a tax cut that will expire next year. He wants to renew it, which will be, and one of the things to recognize when they talk about these big numbers, like it'll cost $2 trillion, it's a 10-year projection. So in the scheme of things, $2 trillion over 10 years, we have to remember our economy is in nominal dollars is a 25 or 26 trillion dollar economy. So spending $250 million is 1%.
Contrast to everything you said there, the deficit of the United States does have a second derivative that's quite.
Right, yeah. And
positive. It's really indicative of instability.
yeah, I mean, this year it's supposed to go up to close to $2 trillion. And it had fallen to like 1.3.
So, what can we do? I mean, like you say, the foreign countries that hold it don't want it to become worthless. Okay, but there's a lot of reason to raise the interest rates to keep people interested in using dollars when there may be an alternative.
No, and that, you know, that's the Fed is trying to do that people will save more at a higher rate of interest and spend less
But
to
that higher rate of interest.
oh, you know, that higher rate of interest. Yeah. In the federal government, the Congressional Budget Office study estimated that the second biggest federal expenditure this fiscal year will be interest. The first being Social Security. Interest expense will exceed national defense.
I look at guys like you, spend a little more time looking at the instability threats instead of saying, well, it looks pretty smooth there.
Okay.
We're cool.
No,
Like,
that's a good point. Okay. And I recognize it and I can, you know, and explain it. But much of those decisions are political, and most economists try to be apolitical. And yeah, I've made an effort to at least present facts. You know, I have my students. I talk about normative and positive economics. Normative economics are statements of opinion. Positive economics are statements of fact. And the one that always gets me is politicians who campaign on, oh, the U.S. has the best healthcare system in the world. That to me, and I ask students, is that a normative or a positive statement? So now for you and I, because of Medicare, yeah, we have a great healthcare system, but in overall, yes. So Any other questions, comments, concerns? Oh, okay. Gross domestic product, GDP, is the value of all goods and services produced in the country in a year. And it's measured at the current prices. Real GDP determines the change in prices that have occurred over from some base period. Today, the base period is 2017. So they replace the current prices with the 2017 prices, and that determines real GDP.
Price of AI services in 2017, but, you know.
Yeah, when there weren't, there weren't, but economists tend to figure out. What's interesting is how many of these high-tech firms employ economists to come up with pricing algorithms and so on. You know, Google hired a really well-known Stanford economist to help them with how do you price their advertising, you know, in terms of, and they've done a good job, you know, with coming up with algorithms to make Google a quite prosperous company. So. Okay. Was this, did you record this? Oh, you recorded on that? Oh, okay. Anyone else?
Reaction from the manager, Greg Berhalter, and the players as soon as we can. Rob Stowe,
Oh,
from this loss. I mean, this one hurts, obviously.
Hmm.
Thank you very much.
oh, you're very welcome. And yeah, I did, besides the notes for this, I also did a presentation on AI to the people, my neighbors and friends and neighbors at Westminster on using AI. So I'll include that with the presentation, and you can, it's on my Google Drive, and have a 40-minute presentation on utilizing AI. Okay, no, thank you guys. I appreciate it.
Taking out the.
Oh, really? Oh, thank you. That's very nice.
Had to come out of the house.
Yeah, right.
I said, do you have one of these?
Yeah.
The second volley didn't look as good as the first one.
Mike Rossman? Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. They're gonna help. Again, I'll post it.
Oh, yeah, let me.
By the way, sorry I was late, but there's some food. Oh, wow. That's supposed to be for this meeting. So,
Feel free to take it home.
yeah. Those are relatively healthy chickens and turkey.
Purely unacceptable, letting the team down. And just think to take yourself out of that, it just.
That was the big flash moment. Remember, there were 2 moments before this which had a major impact on the game.